What was different about writing a book about writing as opposed to the other types of writing that you've done?
Yeah, well, it's obviously it's a different kind of, it's more practical than creative in some ways, although I think that it took a lot of my ideas about teaching that I've been thinking about in terms of how to encourage and express creativity in a way that was useful to other people, and put it under, between covers. So in that way, it was different from writing a novel or short story or essay or anything like that, in that I had very sort of practical ideas of what I wanted to convey, and I knew what I wanted to say basically, while in the creative process you often don't know what you want to say, and you discover it.
How did you go about differentiating advice that you would give other writers versus maybe techniques that you use yourself or things that help you in the creative process?
Well, I guess in many ways I field test the things that I would tell others. I don't just say, well, just do this. Although sometimes, some of the exercises that I came up with for the book were just creative ideas of, an experiment, try this, and I hadn't necessarily tried them, but they seemed to follow from the chapter that I had just written on, whether it was on telling someone else's story, telling your story, writing from a newspaper account, or writing from an anecdote. So in some cases, these were just prompts that developed naturally from what I had written in the chapter.
A large portion of the book is about inspiration. You talk about, keeping a journal, making sure you record your dreams and things like that. What is it about real life and about the way that our experiences affect us that makes such fascinating stories?
Well, I think I don't like to sort of fall back on the sort of old adage of, everyone has a story to tell. They do. They probably have hundreds of stories to tell. But one of the things about being a writer is learning how to observe and to notice things that happen every day in our lives that can make great stories, that are worthy of notice. And that's why I think keeping a journal is an important idea. It's not something that everyone needs to do, but to me, life is just full of stories. I now keep more of a diary than a journal, and I don't record things every day, but I find as soon as I start writing about my day, stories naturally come about, or things that I've overheard. And I don't necessarily have to think that everything's going to be material for a story, but it's a way of noticing my life rather than just sort of letting it slip by. Because if you think about your life 5 years ago, you might recall a kind of general feeling or a particular day or a moment of a day, but you won't recall it with the kind of detail that you would have if you had just taken a few notes on that day. And going back, it's sometimes like reading someone else's life. And then it becomes a kind of sketchbook. If you do write stories, then you are able to go back and sort of plumb those days and those sketches for characters or scenes within the story.
Right. Yeah. I find that a lot of these books about writing sort of give you the idea of a lifestyle. It's not specifically about writing, but it's about noticing, and it's about paying attention and living a way that's more creative. Were there any other books about writing that you were particularly inspired by, both before you wrote it and then since then?
Yeah, often the criticism of how-to books, and it's fair criticism, is that they try to give you a kind of, they paint the idea of the creative life with a broad brush, as though this is the right thing for everyone. But some of the books that that give you ideas about writing. I hope, like mine, are books that that take both a practical approach, but also a more holistic approach too. So the book that I loved was a book by Dorothea Brand called Becoming a Writer. And it was originally published in the 1930s and then reissued again. I think it's still in print. And it's a really relevant book because she was one of the first people to talk about right side and left side of the brain and also the habit of being a writer, which I think is really important. I think that ultimately we teach ourselves how to write, and our teachers are not only the people who are our mentors, but our classmates and the books we read, and all of these are our teachers. And so a book like mine is meant to be a supplement to all of that, and a book like Dorothea Brand's gives you a way into thinking of yourself as a writer, which when I read that book in my 20s, it was really important to me because she just gave me advice, fairly simple advice, like write in the morning, write consistently, so that from one day to the next, you're writing at the same time, so that you're sort of training your mind to make it a habit. And that was really invaluable advice for me, and I still stick to it because it makes writing a lot easier to have a particular time that you write. And so things like that, maybe from each of these books you'll get one or two pieces of advice that stick with you, but they might be priceless. For those bits of advice that you remember are things that will carry you forward as a writer.
Yeah. Being a writer is so about keeping that sort of routine, making sure you're always writing. And I find that with a lot of writers it varies, but a major factor of it is consistency. What are your, right now, what are your writing practices and how have they changed in your writing career?
I was writing right before I came to this interview. I was in my hotel room working on trying to finish an essay that I've got a deadline for. I'm at a point in my life where I don't procrastinate so much anymore about writing. I used to be one of those writers who, like Dorothy Parker said, she hated writing but loved having written, and that's how I was. Now I just love writing, and I want to write all the time. So I write on planes, I write in hotel rooms. I actually love to write when I'm traveling because it clears my head. I don't have all the daily worries that about school or my kids or whatever. I'm just there even sitting next to a stranger on a plane, I'm able to write. So my writing practices are, now I write every moment that I can, but I also get out in the world and walk around. I'm a flaneur. I like to walk around and observe.
When you were an undergraduate student, how did you find time? Did you find a lot of time to write outside of your academic career?
As an undergraduate?
Mm-hmm.
Probably. Well, I actually started writing. I came from a writing family, so my background was a little unusual in that way. My parents were both writers, so I wrote from a very early age. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I was writing in journals and such from the time I was 13 or 14. So it was something I developed early, but it was really scattershot approach. And of course, in school, it became more difficult with my other classes, but I still wrote. I wrote a lot of stories and poems, and it was fun to do all of that and share and go to readings and really start to envision myself as a writer and part of a writing community in college.
As a teacher of writing, has there been anything that you've noticed that students struggle with now more or less than they have in the past?
What do they struggle with? Well, it depends on the level of students. So undergraduates, I think they always struggle in terms of, let's say, a short story. I teach a lot of different kinds of writing, but in terms of a short story, it's often characterization. And it's always been that, the making sure that the character seems as though he or she didn't just pop into existence with the first sentence of your story, but that character has a sense of history. And that's something that a lot of people struggle with. So you get characters named Bob or Jane or whatever, and they're just names on the page, and you don't have any sense of them as real individuals. So teaching that, I think, embracing that and the need to really make these sort of fleshed out characters is something that students always have difficulty with. At the graduate level, it's a little different in that students are more worried about the next step in their careers, and so it's what's after this, what's after graduate school. So there's that kind of concern for them.
It's interesting. What would you say to students who do want a future going to get their MFA, or students who are in undergraduate who want to pursue a career in creative writing, but are still in the sort of throes of practicing and sort of tailoring their craft?
There are a lot of different careers. Sometimes people think that the only path is in academia, and that's not the case. A former student of mine, a wonderful graphic memoirist named Kristen Radke, just reminded me recently when I had her visit the Writers' Center in Singapore, which I've been running. She said, not all people need to go into academia. They can go into into publishing. So she's now the art director for the Believer magazine in Las Vegas. She also worked as a marketing director for Saraband Press in New York. And so, but if you want to go into the academic route, I think it's really important the MFA alone won't do anything for anyone anymore. You need it's so competitive that you need, at least to get a job, usually a book. But I often tell people now, if they're interested in academia, to get the MFA, use that time to write and to practice one's craft. But after that, to think about a PhD if they want to go into academia, because it's likely that that will make them more marketable and more appealing to departments that want someone who can do more than just creative writing classes, but a kind of wider spectrum of courses, including literature courses.
Yeah. Recently, you've been more interested in writing about histories of words, about linguistics. And I find that writing in itself is very often an interdisciplinary concept. How do you see the relationship between history and creativity in this case?
In the case of my words, the words that so the book that I'm working on, creating stories from word origins. I think history is a million stories, and I've always loved history. When I was a teen, I would routinely pick up history books at a used bookstore and just read them like comic books. I also read comic books, but I read these history books too, and I found that they were fascinating, to read. They really spurred my creativity. I'm always amazed by people who say they don't like history. It's often because of the way it's taught. I always think that history should be taught by as a series of individual stories, rather than memorizing dates. The Council of Trent, what year was that? Of course, that's boring. Narrative makes anything interesting, and so to me, history and creativity are really tied. If you're ever looking for a story, you only have to look as far back as or just look at some period of history, and it's chock full of stories.
What small piece of advice would you give yourself as an undergraduate student looking to write more, looking to write better?
To give myself when I was undergrad? That's an interesting question. I like that. I would probably say make sure you finish what you start. You know, make sure you finish what you start, even if you don't like it. Getting it down, getting a draft down is important, because I think when I was an undergraduate, I would get frustrated easily and then abandon something too soon.